Gentlemen, welcome. Great to have you all. This is episode 6 of Scotch and AI, and today we'll be talking about what is it with data fabrics? What is this thing called a data fabric? What does it mean? Where did it come from? Because it seems to be getting a lot of buzz in the marketplace. And I remember coming across the term quite a few years back, which I'll sort of articulate shortly. But I've got 3 experts here to dig into that, because we're seeing the term get a lot of traction in the market, and a lot of vendors beginning to talk a lot more about data fabrics. What is a data fabric? What's it useful for? What are its use cases, etc. And it's almost one of those terms like big data that everybody's jumping on board and wanting to sort of work with or exploit the interest around that. So but before we do that, I'd love to have our guests introduce themselves. So I might throw it straight out to Raj. Why don't you just give us a bit of a background, Raj, which will help us to understand why we would listen to you about data.
Sure. Look, so Raj Dalal, I'm a founder and principal analyst at Big Insights. So I got interested in this whole area of big data about 8 years ago. In fact, Mark, I must have met you very early on in that journey as well. I got interested in this whole emerging usage of data and AI in a startup I was working about 10 years ago. And I could see how this could revolutionize the way all industries would go. And most recently, I've been at Gartner as their principal advisor in data and AI, mainly working with large corporate and government clients on with chief data officers, etc., on how you can implement a data strategy for a business, for sort of business outcomes.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to throw it to Thanh.
Thanks, Mark. So Raj, that's quite impressive. I might leave the room now.
No, not at all.
So Thanh Nguyen, look, I had the pleasure of leading the enterprise architecture function at Services Australia, and we did a lot of cool work related to technology and design, and we've seen a lot of that roll out and be tapped and reused across the enterprise, and some of them being tapped for cross-government use. So very exciting there. Previously, I was at IBM looking after databases for, at the time it was Medicare and Health Insurance Commission. But right now, I'm very excited to be part of the Teradata Corporation, and I'm working on how to unify analytics, right? So, and data fabrics is a topic that I'd love to take part in.
Yeah, in fact, I should have warned. So I've known Thanh for a little while, back when you were working with DHS, which is now Services Australia. Yep. And Than's actually crossed over to the dark side, over to the vendors, the vendor world. He's gone to the darker end of the spectrum of the dark side, because he's actually working with it. I'll unpack that a little bit later. We'll have some fun with that.
That's good. Yeah.
And David, just wondered if you could introduce yourself for us.
Yes, David Triggs. So I'd have to start by saying I came from the dark side. I spent many years working for large technology suppliers all across Asia Pacific and Japan, implementing large-scale computing and technology solutions, but also with an interest in data and an interest over many years in artificial intelligence. And so about 8 years ago now, started getting interested first in big data, and then later also in analytics, particularly machine learning and deep learning. And I think the combination of those across a lot of organizations has the power. I probably shouldn't use the word digital transformation, but it has the power to create a great deal of business value. And that's something that interests me greatly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And digital transformation is another one of those buzzwords that everybody's jumping on board. Perhaps we'll do a session one day on what is the definition of digital transformation? What does it
Yeah,
really
I think if you can explain that, then, you'd be a better man or everyone would really appreciate that anyway.
Well, let's have a bit of fun with that. So I think David's hit the nail on the head. Digital transformation, at the core of digital transformation, you've got to have the evolution to the next level of the analytics-driven organization. So you're exploiting all your data, not just tiny little subsets of it that happen to make it into a data warehouse. I can't say all of it, but you're exploiting a lot more of your data than the traditional model, which was 5% or 10% that happened to make it into the enterprise data warehouse. And then you're using that data in more what are regarded as more cutting-edge ways. So machine learning, AI, process automation, intelligent process automation, all that kind of stuff. That, to me, would be, I guess, my little 30-second definition of digital transformation. Who wants to go next?
I'll jump in, Mark.
Okay, perfect.
So look, agree with you that bingo buzzword, digital transformation, right? Everyone knows that it's there. They need to take their organization to a better place. And how do they do that? So, digital transformation is one of those vehicles that aspire to do that. But I see two different ends of the spectrum. One is that a lot of orgs will be rolling out, new shiny capabilities. But really, in essence, they're actually incremental solutions, right? So they're not really transforming. But I noticed that, organizations that observe gaps in the market, that look at, new business models, and come up with new ways of working, new products that the customers never thought they needed. So that, to me, at that end of the spectrum is the transformation. But like you say, Mark, harnessing all the capabilities, right? But then adding on top of that, the creativity side of it as well, and hence a lot of orgs are still trying to aspire to that. That would be my 2 cents.
No, I like that. And of course, to support and enable digital transformation, you've got to have a data fabric.
We might as well, make sure you've got another buzzword in there. But perhaps if I can add, and I'm sure David will have some words on this as well. I did some analysis on some leading edge companies that were using this for business outcomes, and unless you start with the business outcomes in mind, you can get bogged down in the technology side. So whether it be better customer service, lower your acquisition costs, better upsell, cross sell, or if you're in capital intensive, better asset, optimization. You got to have some basic use cases to start off with. And there's a very interesting, there's an index called the FANG Plus Index, which actually on the stock market, that actually tracks companies at the leading edge of using technology as the business enabler. And you actually have a look at the performance of those companies. And in this down market, if you look at this year, most companies are sort of sidelining. They've gone up about 60-70% this year. So because of the situation, you've had this leapfrogging of implementation of digitalization, and the early leaders are now got enormous lead. So this is actually paying back for the early implementers of these investors in this technology.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I've seen some stats from, might have been the World Economic Forum, might have been Accenture, or one of those common consultancies on the kind of value creation that you're talking about, and the acceleration that the early adopters get, that will potentially leave competitors in the dust and unable to ever catch up, because it builds on itself. David, any final thoughts on digital transformation?
Well, I think I agree very much with Raj that you really have to start with the business perspective. But I think there's two things you need to do at the same time. You also need to understand what we're talking about. And I think that's one of the problems with digital transformation, that everyone knows at one level it's important, but it's such a broad term that it also sometimes sounds meaningless. And I think the same thing applies to data fabric. And I think, for example, what we're talking about here is we've already narrowed it down to analytic data. And I think there's an importance in understanding what we're talking about, because the analysts, even Gartner, will include traditional ETL in their definition of a data fabric, and Forrester are particularly bad at this. And I think that creates a situation where existing suppliers can tell people, oh, you already have a data fabric, it's our current product, or it's the next version of our product. Yeah. And they'll actually miss out on some of the newer technologies like data virtualization that are really addressing some real problems. And one of the real problems with the ETL approach is the amount of time and the amount of effort, particularly when you're exploring, when you're, as Thanh was talking about, when you're exploring, you're looking for new innovations, you're looking at all sorts of data. And you don't want large delays in finding that. So you need fast time to insights to get that data. And the time taken for these traditional ETL processes really slows you down doing that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And then, in fact, that's the perfect segue into I'm going to discuss what I have distilled, I guess, down to 4 different kind of versions of the data fabric that seem to be floating around. And the ETL ESB angle is one of those, which I think does miss the mark in some ways, but we'll discuss that. So I'm going to dive in now. This is a little bit less scripted, I guess, than most of my podcasts, but we'll see how we go. So the first definition, I guess, and you've all, we've socialized this a little bit internally, so this is not completely new to you, but first definition I came across was back when I was working with EMC in the Greenplum days. And they took the Greenplum technology, they took some tech out of VMware, which was an in-memory database called Gemfire, which is kind of the equivalent of Terracotta or SAP HANA, or it's just an in-memory SQL database. Actually, there was a Gemfire version which was Java object-based, and there was a SQL version of it as well. And so you had this idea of this in-memory data fabric, which could span across the enterprise. It was all in-memory, super real-time. It was ACID compliant. It was read-write. And the idea was you could handle operational workloads as the back end of your ERP and your CRM and all these other systems. And then you would persist in the background. The data would persist to the persistence layer, which was either like a Greenplum database or HDFS, or it didn't really matter. But the concept was that there was this enterprise data fabric then, which managed the operational workloads in real time, persisted it to disk as quickly as possible, ACID compliant, but then you could run all your analytics off that persistence layer. And so the idea was you didn't need your ETLs overnight into the data warehouse. You could support operational workloads, you could support analytical workloads, you could support real-time analytical workloads because your operational systems are writing into that thing in real time. And that sounded to me like, wow, we've solved world hunger here. You know, we've solved the problem of, you know, that every database technology that every large organization or enterprise has with, you know, 25 different databases and silos and this and that and the other. And I actually really did interrogate some of our technical guys on this, because I really did want to sanity check it. You know, you've got the message that your sales guy will give you, which you've got to take with a certain grain of salt because they're in sales. Then you've got the pre-sales guys who are a little bit more technical and tend to be a little bit more transparent, but they still have to toe the line because, you know, part of their package is tied to closing deals. But if you get to the non-customer facing, really technical people, then you get the really honest answers with no filters, right? And so they're the guys you want to talk to if you really want to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a technology. Find them on LinkedIn and have a little chat. But I chatted with these guys down here. Is this real? Can you really do this? And the answer at the time was, yeah, you can if you set it up right with the right kind. Especially and then what emerged in my mind out of that was the object-oriented data warehouse. Your entire data warehouse could be a bunch of Java objects, and then you just manage the life cycle of that. And I started on a white paper on that and never finished it. But anyway, I've rambled on a little bit.
I think a lot of those things didn't take off, Mark. I think in theory, that was all great. And I can remember SAP HANA when it first came out, right? I mean, it was 7-8 years ago as well, with that promise. But if you look at the adoption of that type of technology, it was very niche. It never took off in mainstream. So I think we're still left with the problem of proliferation of data and different type of data storage. And I think that's the issue that I think we need to address somehow.
Yeah, I think so. And I
data
think
fabric could be modern data fabric. Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to break your introduction.
no, that's okay. I no, what I was about to say is probably a little bit outside of school. We'll have to take that discussion offline. But there are particular vendors, I think, who rode that wave and then destroyed the value that any business could have got out of it. But I won't name names because I could get myself into trouble. Tan, any thoughts on that concept? Actually, I'll jump to David. That what I've just articulated as my initial, version 1 of the data fabric. Without talking about version 2, which is let me think. So let me just demarcate these quickly before we dive into them. So version 2 would be just the single database vendor who says they've got a data fabric that does everything. Then you've got your ETL, ESB, API type layer, which they call a data fabric. And then you got the virtualization technologies, which is another angle on the data fabric. So before we jump into those other three, maybe we can chew the fat on the first one, which is this in-memory supported by a persistence layer handling operational and analytical workloads, and everything's in real time because it's all in memory. David.
It reminds me of quite a number of years ago now. I was doing enterprise architecture work for Hewlett Packard at the time, and I was working on some data center next generation architecture methodologies that we use globally. And I came across a paper by some people in HP Labs on enterprise architecture, and they created this whole enterprise architecture for HP, and they said, the only problem was then we decided to implement SAP, and it had its own architecture. And I think one of the things that kind of acts against the unifying concept you were talking about, Mark, is that, as Raj was saying, things are very, very siloed today. People might have SAP for ERP, which has its own architecture. They might have gone Salesforce for CRM, which has its own cloud as well as its own architecture. Yeah. And all of these things are very different. And a lot of organizations today are trying to move fast by aggregating services and offerings from a range of different suppliers. And it's very difficult to get them all sitting on this one architecture. And I think that's what makes it difficult. And I think you need to look for other solutions.
Yeah, actually, I like that. In fact, I'm going to pivot here a little bit. I've thrown out. I was going to discuss each one of those four in turn, but I think we'll just throw the four out there and see what sticks. So the second concept, I guess, of the data fabric was, I think MapR probably came the closest to a reality with this thing, where you did have something that supported operational workloads, or was able to stream operational data into it in real time and then support the analytic workloads off that. Can one vendor do it all? And I'm going to open it up to the dark side here, Tan. Because here's my take on Teradata, right? I actually wrote Teradata off about 5 years ago. I think these guys are just, the sun has set on this, and every Teradata warehouse is a sunset application, was kind of my thoughts that I didn't say too much, especially when they I think in Australia, they let go of 90% of their account managers in 1 year at one point. And I just thought that it's over for these guys. But it sounds like something else is coming out. So, Tan, maybe you can unpack that for us. You guys have come back. I've been with Teradata for a short stint, but I'm actually very excited once I've had a look under the hood, right? And it aligns to my personal mission of really unifying analytics for organizations, right? Unifying analytics at scale for organizations, and I think these guys can help organizations do that. So what does that look like in the real world? What are you actually deploying in order to support that?
Well, with a product called Vantage, right? What you can do is, run all your analytic workloads in platform, right? So I can run, any flavor of language on the platform, right? I can run R, SAS, you name it. I can access JSON, native object stores on-prem and in the cloud on Azure, AWS, GCP in one query. And that's what I love about the idea of unifying such a platform. That's not to say that, that is the only answer, but I think that goes part to enabling an enterprise capability such as the data fabric that we're talking about. And
Interesting.
That's why I'm really excited about this.
Yeah. Well, what you've described actually sounds a lot to me like data virtualization. So I might throw to either Raj or David, whoever wants to jump in. What is data virtualization now? Because that's another thing that's emerged. We've got Denodo, I think, claiming a little bit of that space. There's a couple of other vendors that Zataris is the most interesting one to me, I think, because it's an Australian product and an Australian startup that already has unicorn status, I believe. But before we jump into Advantage or Zataris or Denodo, maybe Raj or David, you can jump in and explain what is this data virtualization? What does it mean? How does it work? What does it look like? And what's the most appropriate sets of use cases that it can support? Or what problems does it solve? That's probably an even better question.
Perhaps, look, I can have a quick get started on that, and David, perhaps you can jump in. I think that's a very exciting technology, and a lot of the data fabrics I think that's been talked about recently have come from the data virtualization space. It's one of the 3 or 4 different styles that are now being merged together. It's really about having that abstraction semantic layer where you're separating the physical data storage with the access layer. So whether it be for self-service use cases or whether for analytics, data science workloads, or even data products, is you're having that a semantic layer. So you don't have to worry about where the data is coming from. And I think that's really important at the moment because the proliferation not only of type of data sources, but also with multi-clouds that large enterprises anyway are deploying. You've got part of your data in Azure, some of it in AWS, GCP as well as these private these SaaS providers. So having that common abstraction layer where you've got a curated views of your data, so you can do the analytics on top. And I think there's 2 types of use cases. One is for transaction. That's where traditionally a lot of these the visualization software has come from, and the more recent is the analytics use cases on top of this visualization platform. So something that provides us this abstraction layer, but as well provides the metadata, the security, and the compliance, so you can provide this the service to the enterprise without having to get lots and lots of data architects involved every time there's a new project. I think that's the exciting part of these, new virtualization, and which is now really fabrics as well.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the technical part of me wants to dive right in and say, how the hell does it actually work? I don't know whether we want to go that deep or not. Maybe we can just tell the story.
Well, I think it's useful to think about it a little bit in that if you think about analytic data, there's the old saying, "Show me follow the money." I think you can follow the query. With operational, it's a little bit more complex. That in a lot of cases with analytic data, you start with some sort of a query, probably expressed in SQL or something that generates a SQL query, and you have to access that data somewhere. And the traditional view of that is it all has to be in the database or the data warehouse. And in order for it to all be there, you have to move it all in there, which takes a lot of time and forward planning. And I think that the key thing about virtualization is that when you start with that query, the virtualization layer has the ability to pull that information back from different places. And there's different forms of that. And so, for example, Teradata has one inside the platform that Thanh was discussing. There's a thing called Grid Query, which is like a lot of these, essentially a distributed distributed query engine. And Zataris is another one. So you can literally hook up anything that generates SQL queries, such as Power BI or one of those things. And it will actually allow you to access data from across a range of sources. And I think, to me, for analytics, that's the essence, that you have something that operates through a more or less standard SQL type of interface, but allows you to get at data wherever it is.
Yeah, so if we break it down, then it sounds like you're saying typically you might have your legacy Hadoop cluster over here that you bought from Cloudera 5 years ago. You might have your, dare I say it, legacy Teradata data warehouse, the traditional EDW. You got a little bit of sitting in Greenplum or Vertica or what was that IBM product?
Netezza.
Yeah, that one, Netezza. And then you've got these silos. Some are analytical, some are operational, and then your business user sits up here, and they don't care where the data is. They just want access to it, right? And not only that, you want to be able to access it in such a way that it doesn't matter which silo it's in, and it doesn't matter which tool you're coming at it from. So you kind of got this fabric in the middle. I'll use the term fabric, but data virtualization is probably the nearest thing to that now. Where, to Tan's point, actually, you can come in with a Java type query, you can come in with a SQL query, you can come in with SAS, you can come in with R or Python, you can come in with some, the next trendy data science language that hasn't been written yet, and the data fabric figures out, or at least exposes in a semantic type layer, what's available, and then figures out how to distribute the workloads to something down under there, which is wherever that data happens to be persistent, or it could be in the cloud. I mean, I haven't even mentioned cloud, but that's part of that. Now, am I hitting the mark, Tan? Does that sound like?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Mark, and I think you've summarized David's commentary really nicely. But I want to come back to it from the angle of, so what, right? So, if we're looking at organizations and we're looking at what CEOs and the senior executives are, have at the front of their minds, and a lot of the times it's actually visibility of how their organization is going, how they're doing operationally, how they're doing strategically, right? But next to that is the organization's capability in decision making, right?
Sure,
So
yeah, the cultural thing, right?
Yeah, and this is why I'm so excited about the concept, the capability, and I dare say technology is a part of that data fabric capability, but not the whole part. I think it's an enterprise capability where people and process and culture come in. So how do we make that data fabric, accessible across the organization, and how do we make it available straight away without waiting for it to be perfect, so people can start to explore, experiment, prototype use cases with data, right? So on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end of the spectrum is your BAU stuff where it's very defined use cases, right? So you keep that back-end stuff happening. So I see the data fabric for organization more of an enterprise business capability that feeds up into lifting that decision-making capability for the organization, and also adding fidelity to that visibility of the CEOs and the senior executives, and this is why I think it's so exciting to be in this space.
Yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head, I think, with a few things there, because it was always about, when I used to do the information management strategy type work, there was always the technology layer, there's always a process and methodology layer, including a lot of knowledge management, metadata management. How do you expose it, the right data to the right person for the right use case? There was always the skill set org chart type layer of the journey, and then there was the actual data and the use cases that you were trying to solve. And when IT guys come into this, we can solve the technology. That's probably the easiest thing to get right. It's the cultural change, particularly when you sometimes have senior leadership who are still more interested in trusting their gut instinct, I guess, than necessarily the analytics. And that's a journey that you have to sort of take the organization on. Maybe we'll come back and talk about the cultural aspects of digital transformation one of these days. But the other thing that I think that I want to add to what you said, Tan, is that all of the problems that I just talked about in my summary prior to what you've just said was really around solving the problems that are legacy, EDWs, BI workloads, and so on. We've also got to have this data fabric or the data virtualization layer able to support the AI, machine learning models spitting out real-time predictions on the basis of real-time data that's coming in, that kind of thing. And also process automation. Can I throw it to Raj? What are you seeing in the market? Is anybody actually doing this stuff, or is it all still just at the point where the vendors are pretending that everybody's doing it?
Look, there's definitely a couple of early players that have making some inroads here, and they're working with some of the larger companies. And one of the companies that I'm just helping at the moment, Zataris, is doing a good job of extending that whole virtual layer to more of a fabric. And what I mean by that is actually having that whole governance and data quality in real time, so that even though you can access a lot of the data, you can curate the data. You should be able to write not just policies that when data don't join this data with that data because you're going to breach some privacy or some regulation. What you do want to have is in real time to actually stop those queries being run, whether it be for from data science models or whether it be in real time ad hoc type queries. So we're seeing a lot of innovation going on in this space, and a couple of things that if I could just add to what Tan was saying as well is it's all about also speed to insight. There is definitely as part of the cultural change, you need to get over the fact, or you need to educate the people that you don't have to wait 3 months, 6 months for the data to be consolidated, data warehouse to be built, and then you'll be able to do your insights, right? It's about, can we deliver something in, days or weeks that traditionally would have taken, months to deliver to get that insights. And it's really about the speed to insight as well, which I think we shouldn't forget.
Yeah, now let me pick up on that because I heard a story, and it was specifically regarding, in this case, Zataris, that I thought it's probably worth unpacking. But it was a telco who had this 6-month program to build the next data mart, right? And then some people from Zataris went in and built it in, was it 3 weeks or something like that?
Yeah, I think that they had lots of data from that finance needed from all different data sources, and it was going to be very time consuming to build. And so they built this virtual data fabric accessing the data they required, and they were able to create reports in weeks, which and they were able to recover a lot of revenue recovery because of that, because getting access to data that traditionally was thought too hard to get to. So there's some really interesting, it changes the paradigm in terms of what can be done and the speed at which it can be done. And I think that's why these technologies are so important, because you don't have to build the data lake, right? And we all know how successful some of the majority of the data lakes have been. So I think it's a different paradigm that we really should take a very close look at. David, I want to elaborate on some of this.
Coming together in my head now. I'm seeing there's a persistence or database layer. You got your data virtualization type layer, which is supporting what you've just described. You've got to have governance there, which may or may not be another technology. And I'm looking at something called Okura, which is getting a lot of noise in the market as well, a lot of interest around that space. And then you've got your data catalog, right? Which is another, there's 3 or 4 vendors coming out with data catalogs. It all looks very, very interesting. Trying to think of their names off the top of my head, but I can't. Maybe I'll put it in the notes later on. But it sounds like there's this new ecosystem emerging where the ecosystem used to be source system, ETL, data warehouse, and then BI tool, and now the technology is some kind of persistence layer, which could be Teradata, could be anything, data fabric, data governance, and your data catalog. And so your data governance probably sits over the data catalog, which sits over your virtualization, which sits over your persistence layer. David, what do you think about my little, and in my mind, it's going off like a game of, what's that game where all the blocks fall down and you've got to put them together and then
Pac-Man.
Tetris. Yeah, it's
Right.
for data fabrics or something. Some vendors will do all four, and some vendors will just do one, and some technologies will do three, but not that one. And David, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think that's the right vision. I think the complication to it is when you talk about a persistence layer, it's not one database, because in a typical organization, you're going to have multiple applications, a data warehouse, other things. And so when you then talk about that data fabric, it's not only providing an interface to a single persistence layer that's a single data source, it's actually having to virtualize across a collection of heterogeneous data sources. So it might be an operational database that's in Oracle that you can access directly. It might be an SAP system where no one's going to go near the main operational database, so it's got its own data warehouse component. It may be Salesforce that's off in a cloud somewhere that's quite different. And it somehow has to bring these together in an environment. And to tie this back to the sort of digital transformation, one of the things I've found in digital transformation is that a lot of the value gets derived from the data and what you can do with it. And so data is becoming much more important. So this technology, whereas once it was just on the periphery, it was something the IT people plugged in to make things work, is a very important part of the value creation in the organization today.
Interesting. Thanh, what do you think that across those four layers we've talked about? I'll let you speak on behalf of Teradata. Which of the are you in all of them, or just these two, or how does it work?
I'll speak on behalf of myself because I could get in trouble very easily. But I just wanted to talk about, when we architects and technologists love to categorize and put things in hierarchies so that it's easy for us to understand. Humans like to rationalize things so that we can understand it. But I feel that organizations
come up with some fascinating Buddhist angle on technology here or something.
I feel like organizations are very much like sentient organizations, right?
There is some argument for that, and I've done a lot of reading on that, actually. We'll take that offline one day.
I think if we design our architectures with this mindset, right, that it's almost like an organism that different parts interact with each other, not very mechanically, very organically, right? And I think David was saying a lot of value comes from analytics, from data. So if we look at sentient organizations, right, and there's this idea. I'm going to throw this out, and let's see if David has heard of this term. It's data ergonomics. Has anyone heard of that?
I can't say that I have.
Can't say I have, no.
Oh. So it comes back to what David was talking about. A lot of the value comes from the data, from the analytics. Now, if we look at organizations, picture typical interactions that the workforce, the teams have when they are interacting with data, right? So picture the cohort from the business side of the house. What would be going through their minds? I've got Excel. Oh, how do I run a query to extract from my HANA database? How do I, so, and that's what I mean by data ergonomics. It's actually very hard for people to interact with data, to get to the insights that, fast, was it fast time to insights, Raj?
Time to insight, basically, right? So
I've got this view where how do we make it easy, for people to interoperate with data, right? And it kind of extends the data fabric idea, right? So if we were to measure data ergonomics in the organization, let's say, I'll pick a number out of 10. Let's say we're at 5 for a particular organization. So what do we need to do in terms of standing up that data fabric? What do we need to do to move that number 5 to maybe 9 or 10? And this is the view that I can see us technologists working towards.
Interesting.
I think I've got another buzzword for you there. I'm a data philosopher. I think that's what I'm going to call you. You make a very good point.
I'm just wondering if there's a data RSI, repetitive strain. Things like it.
Yeah, no kidding. Exactly. Yeah,
probably. The RSI is the old data warehousing model where everything needs to be brought together. I think we've done that for 20, 30 years, right? So I think there's got to be a better way, and that's what to tie it back together. That's where the some of the data fabric stuff comes in. But I think you make a very good point. Part of it I think is cultural in the sense that people need to understand that this is possible, and that's where this work around data literacy is not just the technology part of the literacy, but also getting people to understand what is possible. Because they've never seen the possibilities, and I think the other thing is, there's some sort of curation of the data, so they don't have to think about or some different patterns of how data could be joined together in the organization. So, so then they can see how it can be done to help them with day-to-day outcomes.
Yeah, no, I like that. And in fact, I like the way you've tied it back to culture as well, Tan and Raj both, because we started off talking about digital transformation, and there's a significant cultural component of that. Just conscious of time, we'll probably wrap up in a minute or two. David, the intersection between cultural change, digital transformation, data virtualization, and data fabrics. Wrap it all up for us, Mr. Data Philosopher.
Well, I'm not sure I'd use that title. I think I'll have to leave that one for Thanh. But no, look, I think it's important that people don't just assume that because they have ETL, they have a data fabric and there's nothing new to learn. That I think I've spent a lot of time working in the data science area the last few years, and a lot of that is experimental. That and this came up earlier, the way you innovate is by looking at things, at trying things, and fast access to data there it means faster experimentation and faster progress. And I think some of these data fabric techniques, particularly data virtualization, can significantly enhance and speed up that experimentation. And there's a very important cultural dimension to that as well, because at the same time, we need to think about self-service and democratization of the data. So it's not only the IT specialists that have access to that, but business people can go and have a look at and make sense of their own area. And I think that links back to the data ergonomics. So there's a whole lot of things that people need to think about there, but I think there's a lot of value in it if they can do it.
Sounds good. Okay, I think I better wrap it up. This has been a lot of fun. I could talk with you guys for another 2 hours, I reckon. Maybe one day we'll do that. So, but Tan, you're based in Canberra. Raj, you're Sydney.
Yeah.
David, you're
Sydney. Yep.
Sydney as well, and I'm Sydney. So I literally, my first time in the city for 6 months, about 3 weeks ago, I just lined up 3 coffees with people, jumped on the train, went in, had a coffee, jumped on the ferry, went to Manly, had lunch with a friend. I just needed an excuse to get out of the house and make some calls. So if anybody wants a coffee with Raj, with Tan, with David, let us know. Find us on LinkedIn. And I think that's a wrap. Gentlemen, stick around after I close the live stream because I'd love to have just a little bit of a further, little discussion. But I think we'll wrap it up. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Raj, Tan, and David for participating. We'll see you around.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. Great.